Today is May 30th, 2017, and I'm interviewing Father John Staudenmeier. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
So my first question for you is, what led you to the religious life?
I just gave a talk 2 weeks ago at the Detroit Athletic Club for alums of Jesuit schools, and I began it by saying, many people have asked me, why did you become a Jesuit? And I invariably answer by saying, that's not an interesting question. The interesting question is why I stayed a Jesuit. Just like if you ask someone who's married, why did you get married, is much less interesting than why you stayed married. The stories are when you decide to stay. So I was a kid. What did I know at 17? So the answer is, I don't think that's an interesting question.
All right, so why do you stay a Jesuit?
That's a real interesting question. I guess I would say there's a handful of the choices I've made, or choices that entered my life as options, that are the key ones. And I think the main ones were when I was assigned. Do you know what the term Jesuit regency is? Are you familiar with that language?
No.
In the training of Jesuits, you start with a couple of years of learning how to pray. Then you decide whether you're going to enter the Jesuits. That's called the novitiate. Then you have about usually 4 to 5 years of studying in college. And then you do 3 years usually of working in some Jesuit work somewhere. So you join a working group of Jesuits. Normally it's teaching in some Jesuit school. And I was assigned to the prep school in Milwaukee, something like the Detroit UD High over on 7 Mile. And I'd moved in. I was going to teach sophomore Latin and moderate the yearbook. And about the beginning of August, I got a letter from the provincial superior saying, we need you to change plans. Instead of starting in Milwaukee, please go to Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and be ready to start the last week in August on the Lakota Sioux Pine Ridge Reservation. So that was August 1964, 50-some years ago. I've often thought, what would have happened to my life had in those 3 pretty formative years? You're pretty young, you're learning if you're any good at anything. That's kind of what that's about. Do you have competency? If I had gone to Marquette High School, I have no idea what my life would be like. But I would say landing at Pine Ridge, South Dakota, transformed me. I was just scout there. I go there every year for about a week. I just came back yesterday. I gave an award-winning talk. Award-winning? No, it was an award that said you can give a talk. It was for my History of Technology Professional Society. It was their Lifetime Achievement Award called the Leonardo da Vinci Medal. And with it comes a talk, and I decided to talk about how I integrate a life of prayer with a life of the secular academy. And I told some stories, and I began with the story of Pine Ridge. When I went to Pine Ridge, I did not know much about anything. I had lived in a very sheltered, all-white town, with one exception, 12,000 people, one black person who shined shoes. Now, you're just a kid. That's just the normal world for you. So I grew up right after World War II in the longest actual economic boom. I mean by actual, a very high percentage of the population notably improved their life. Not just well-to-do people, not just investors. So I grew up being part of a country that had won a war that was the only popular war in our history, World War II. And we won it with sophisticated technology, sophisticated science, and we were fighting evil enemies. That's a luxury in a war. So that's where I grew up. I didn't know how complicated the world was. So when I got to the reservation, at age 24, I wasn't used to radical poverty. Unemployment rate in Pine Ridge was 85%. My first year teaching there, our high school lost 33% of its students. They quit. Suicide rate about 10 times the national average. I just wasn't used to any of that. I didn't know that world existed. So learning how to be welcomed into that place was a pretty pivotal part of my life. One last piece of that, I had come from doing a master's in philosophy, European philosophy. And one of the things that I didn't realize about European philosophy at the time is that there was an underlying assumption that European cognitive methodologies, scientific method, that sort of thing, rendered all other forms of human thinking anywhere in the world as objects of study rather than as methods that can teach you something. That's no longer true if you were to study the same things that I studied back in the 70s. It's no longer true, but it was when I went back to school. So when I began to realize on the reservation that these adults and adolescents that I was engaged with were posing a question without raising it. They were posing a question. Was their way of thinking and understanding the world appear to what I had learned in my European-based philosophical sophistication, or were they not appear at all, that they were just objects of study? That turned out to be a pretty tough conversion process for me. But little by little in those 3 years, I began to say, this is a learning world. This is another way of seeing reality. So that process is one of the reasons I'm a Jesuit. It is why I go back there every year to renew old friends. I consider it would be hard for me to imagine how I would understand my world and my life without that. So that's a major one.
All right. So my next question is, why did you choose the Jesuits?
I already told you, that's not an interesting question.
Okay. Then my next question would be, can you tell us about your formation and your academic background?
Yeah, well, I told you a big piece of it just now when I said in my training, after I'd gotten a master's degree in college in philosophy, I then went to the reservation and I gradually, I'd say, learned how to teach there, but also I learned how to be an adult there. I came in there at age 24. You don't know a lot at 24. So I would say what that 3-year period is meant to do for young Jesuits, it worked for me. It confronted me with larger realities than I knew existed. It was very hard on me. I was living with savage grief. A lot of those kids lived with savage grief. And when I gradually realized that I cared about them as peer humans, then their savage grief became my savage grief. And that changes you. And it is why I go back there to this day. I live now in a university where I'm a highly regarded, internationally known scholar, university person. You can get an attitude if you live in the environment of a university. It helps me to go back and remember this university sits in a larger world than its own excellence. And so that's part of my formation. But another part of my formation was when I finished the 3 years on the reservation and came back and started studying theology. Back was in St. Louis at the time. I went into about an 8-month-long severe depression. And it was probably because, I realized that up until that point, I had stuffed the question, do I really actually want to become a Roman Catholic priest? I just said, I'll get to that when I finish all the other things I'm doing and I'm starting to get close to having to choose to be ordained. So I was at now the point where I had to choose to be ordained or not. But another thing that was going on at that time is I had learned to see my own culture, middle class white culture, as from the perspective of the violence that it did, just by the way it was. I'd seen the violence on the reservation, and I despised my own culture. That was very hard on me. I think it was my second year of 3 years of studying theology before I got ordained. I was making an 8-day Jesuit retreat out in a suburb of St. Louis called Florissant, which was at that time the fastest growing suburb in the United States. And that's because McDonnell Douglas was there and was ramping up for the Vietnam War production. So it was a hugely growing place. Well, the Jesuits had a farm there that went back 150 years. And I was there, and they sold, the Jesuits did, a fair bit of the farmland. And they still had a pretty good sized piece of property, but it was more like a park, with buildings and stuff. So this was about 4 months into that depression I was telling you about, and I one day was sitting on, those kind of green park benches that are still around in different places. I was sitting on one of those by myself, and I was looking across the fence at what had been a farm field and was now a new development. After World War II, the United States guaranteed mortgages on new developments anywhere in the country, but not guaranteed mortgages on redoing urban things. And that was because they were afraid that the 16 million people in uniform were going to riot because they couldn't get jobs. And so they passed the GI Bill, so a lot of them went to college, first time in their family's life. And then they started building houses in big tracts. So that meant carpenters, plumbers, stonemasons, and then manufacturing, stoves, furniture, blah, blah, blah. So it provided lots of jobs. Well, this was one of those booming places, and in that field, there was one row of them that were almost ready to turn the key on them. The windows were in, the doors were in, the roof was done, and so on. Next one, they were about half the way there. The walls were up, but the ceiling, the roof wasn't there yet, and so on. The next one, you had the foundations and the beginning of the plumbing, and the next one. So they were row after row after row of houses. And I remember looking at them, and I remember I was in the 4th month of a very severe depression, and the depression had a lot to do with despising my own culture. And I looked at this, and this sort of said it all. These houses were sort of devouring the land. They were very boring. They were all the same. They were a sort of a relentless machine eating that farm field, is the way it felt to me. And I was praying at the time about a place in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius where Jesus says to whoever is making the retreat, I'd like you to follow me in falling in love with the whole world, leaving nothing out. And I was sitting there, and I had this moment where this doesn't happen often, but maybe 8 times in my life, I said something to Jesus in English, and Jesus answered me in English. My point being, it was an imagination I had, which Ignatius says, when you pray, use your imagination and allow yourself to be engaged in what you're doing. Well, this is a key moment. I said to Jesus, I know why I can't pray this prayer of yours about loving the world. You have hope for this shit. And I was looking at those rows of houses, and I don't. To which Jesus answered, you're right, I do have hope for this. Now, I'm going, meaning going into your culture. Are you coming? And I remember just sitting there and going, Didn't stop the depression. That lasted another 4 months. The depression ended the next summer on the Pine Ridge Reservation. But what it said to me is, the calling of Jesus for a Jesuit is, where in the world are you called to be, and how do you live so that you can get to that place? So I have good friends that live in Africa and have for decades. And you say, if you're going to go to Africa, you have to get to Africa. You have to become fluent in Africa. Well, I had thought that maybe what I was called to do was move to the reservation and basically live there for the rest of my life. But it didn't turn out that way. It turned out that I became an academic, a historian of technology, and what I was working to understand was the violent tension between Western technologies, that would be European and American technologies, and non-Western cultures. And I became an academic, and I've been an academic ever since. So I paid attention to what happened in that prayer, saying, this world of the United States culture, middle class culture, world dominant culture, needs my attention and my affection. I cannot go around treating it just with contempt. So that was a biggie. I suppose the next big one after that was when I agreed to, I threw my hat in the ring to become the editor-in-chief of the most important international scholarly journal in the history of technology, and it changed my life. I did that for 15 years. And I suppose another big one was when I agreed to be the interim dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Education here for 3 years, while I was editing the journal, which was a very tiring, it wore on me. And then I finished my 3-year stint that I'd committed to, and I took a year off and went to the Center for Science, Technology, and Society in Santa Clara, California for a year. And I was going to come back to the history department, and my president here, Father Stockhausen, asked me not to do that, but to leave the faculty and become what I am now, the assistant to the president for mission and identity. The effect of that was that I taught for 21 years. I loved teaching. I know a whole lot of former students. And at this point, hardly any students know me. I think you'd agree with that. I'm just an old guy walking around here. Back then, if this was 15 years ago, a lot of your peers would know me. Maybe you'd know me too. Hundreds of students knew me. And I loved it. But right now, everybody that works here for pay knows me. So the people in the grounds crew, the people up on the third floor in the accounting world, the dean's offices. So I've changed who I pay attention to. That was a big deal. So what I've said is these are some of the key decisions that shaped the way I live my life. And if I hadn't found those worthwhile questions to answer, shall I do this? If I hadn't thought they were worthwhile questions, probably you could say, why did you stay a Jesuit? It looks like you don't care about anything. So these questions were how I lived out caring about how I lived my life. And they are why I'm a Jesuit, even though they're specifically different parts of it. Does that help?
All right, yes. So my next question is, what led you to your role at University of Detroit Mercy?
Same thing.
Okay.
No, I can say a couple things. When I got my PhD, I was at the University of Pennsylvania. My Jesuit provincial superior at that time had said, I think I'd like to assign you more or less permanently to Korea. Now that was a place that the Jesuits of my part of the world were investing in at the time. And I was shocked at that. I had been, for 7 years, working on my doctoral dissertation at Penn. And I said to him, I think my calling is not Korea. It's the culture of the United States, which kind of goes back to that story about Florissant, Missouri. Well, we had quite a to-do, he and I, for a while, like 6 months. It was a long 6-month discernment, which is what we Jesuits call that. And the result of that discernment was he told me, I knew you did not want to go to Korea, but I didn't know why. I wanted to know, why didn't you want to go to Korea? Was it because you didn't want the discomfort of a different culture? Is that what was going on? And what I gradually realized over these 6 months is, no, you have a real calling to do history of technology here. And as a result, when I was looking for Jesuit universities that I might go to as a faculty member, they had to be with an engineering school. You don't do history of technology without engineering. That leaves about 5 places. And several of those universities thought that the history of technology was a specialty. And the provincial had said, I don't think you're going to want to go to such and such, because they don't understand that this is not a specialty. This is a field. You teach inside of it. You bring the field with you. So our working together for those 6 months, deciding not Korea but here, also said here, really here, meaning treat what you're called to as the heart of your profession. And the heart of my profession, that's what I came here to do, was to study the manner in which the culture of the United States lives technological decision making and lives with those decisions. So that's my professional identity. And I came here because I chose between here and Santa Clara University. They both offered me a job at that time. And I said at the time, I think I'd rather be at a university in a city that is engaged in the racism of the city, as well as the other things that universities do. Whereas Silicon Valley was in a prosperous boomtown. And I said, so I think it's here. So I came here because we had an engineering school, very important to me. I came here because of the racism. This is the most severely racist metropolitan area, I think, in the country. Suburbs, city mostly. And I said, what a great place to work. So in this case, actually that is a good question, because I knew quite consciously I had other options at the time. So why did I come here in this case is a very good question.
All right. So my next question is, how has your ministry changed over the years?
Oh. All kinds of ways. I'm just thinking of how do you answer a question like that in so many ways. There is a saying about Jesuits and the vow of mobility. Jesuits vow mobility. They vow to go to travel to many places in the world. Just as Benedictines vow stability, and they vow to invest themselves in a monastery somewhere. And so I began to say, what does it mean that I vowed mobility? It means, in Ignatius, that you try to decide often in your prayer, where am I now? And am I drawn, called to go somewhere else? Or to go deeper in where I am now? And that's when that pervades your life, and it does for lots of Jesuits. A lot of Jesuits understand that when they travel, they try to discern where they're going and why they're going there rather than somewhere else. Whether you're just talking about a convention you're going to, like I'm going to be debating about my History of Technology convention, which this year is the end of October. I try to go to those meetings, and Ignatius says, when you go anywhere, try to ask for the grace of intimate knowledge of that place. Which means the place is, what is the place? So when I go to, I was to California for a board meeting 2 weeks ago. At that same place that I didn't go to. I'm on a board there. So when I went there, we were having an all-day retreat for our advisory board of the Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurs. By the way, we have that center here also. Phil Cook in the business school has been creating that center. He trained in Santa Clara for this. I went out there. We had about a 7-hour meeting, and it was a terrific meeting. It's a 1 year, we do it every year, we do a retreat. And there may be 25 or 30 members of that board, most of them Silicon Valley people. And we were talking about, as a group, at Santa Clara, what are we called to this coming year? What did we learn last year? That sort of a thing. Well, that day I was very much immersed in Silicon Valley. And I needed to be. That's what I went there for. You try to get to where you go. Well, sometimes it means you're going to move to Korea for the rest of your life. And in my Jesuit discernment, we said, no, not for me, but I have a good friends that lived in Korea most of their lives. So when I choose to go somewhere, I try to know why I'm going there. And then I try to let that place welcome me. So I've been going to Pine Ridge, South Dakota for 50 years. And I was there, this time I was there for about 8 days. And I have friends that go back almost 50 years and their kids. And a lot of those friends are now dead, but not all of them are dead. So, what am I doing when I'm there? I'm trying to let those people who have become dear to me welcome me into their homes and their lives this year on their terms, rather than me trying to do good for them. I mean, you do good when you love people and you let people love you. And so I would say, if you think, I'm always very sad when I leave the reservation. That's been true since 1965. And what Ignatius would say is, if you live the vow of mobility and you go to places and you allow that place to welcome you and matter to you, and you'll know that by the fact that you're sad when you have to leave there. And if you're never sad, you shouldn't be a Jesuit. That's probably a way to put that. I have only a few times thought seriously about leaving here after I came here. And it has seemed to me that this is my place. I've turned down jobs in other Jesuit universities. But it seemed to me this is a calling for me. However, I've been on the MIT's faculty 5 different times. I've been at Boston College for 2 years. I've been at Santa Clara for a couple of years. So, and in both of those last 2, they wanted me to come there. So you think about, am I called to change where I am or not? Is it just self-indulgent for me to be here? Because I'm really familiar with Detroit. I love Detroit. I'm really pumped up about Detroit's rebirth. So then you should be asking, is that the fact that I'm thrilled to be here, is that self-indulgent immaturity on my part? Or is it part of my calling to go deeper and deeper into here? And for Jesuits, that's the way you try to decide things. So, so far, it has seemed to me, and I've made this decision a few times, it has seemed to me, no, I think this is my place in the world. But I've traveled so much, mostly Europe and the US, I've never been in Asia for some reason, and only once in Latin America. So mostly for me, it happens to be around the US and in Europe. And I have very close friends in Munich, in Stockholm, in Norway, in Britain, in Italy, in Germany, in Boston, in central Massachusetts, in Canada, in Pittsburgh, in St. Louis, in California, in Denver, in Pine Ridge, and some I'm not thinking about. And years ago, a very wise Jesuit said, if you live the vow of mobility, then you don't have to worry about living the vow of poverty. The longer you live, the poorer you'll get. I still am healthy enough and have the resources to travel to many, but not all of the places I just named. But the places I'm not able to get to are a source of grief to me. I allowed that place to welcome me on its terms. It came to matter to me. If a Jesuit is not sad about places, real places in the world and real people in those places, and you can't go everywhere, then I think you should go get out of the Jesuit and go sell pickles or something. Being a Jesuit means you let the world matter to you, but you mean specifically you let the world matter to you in different places. Now, I'm 77, I'm still pretty healthy, I've got a lot of energy. But there will come a day, either I'll go under a bus or something and have a nice funeral that way, or I will retire to a Jesuit place, probably the one up here in Clarkston, Columbia Center. And I will, obviously, at some point, either I die before this happens or I gradually diminish because of my health and my age and all those things. And there will come a time when I can no longer go to the places where people love me and I love them. That's real poverty. I cannot grow old where all of the people I love live because they don't all live in the same place. So that's a very Jesuit thing. And Jesuits have a calling to risk that, to risk intimacy in many places and to risk sadness when you can no longer do that. But I would say one of the most important things in my life, I risk sadness pretty much every day in my life because I live so that people from all those different places, we've got great social media and things like this now, and I use telephones a fair bit. So when you love somebody deeply, I have a very good friend of 25 years who's on a faculty at a school in Lewiston, Maine. I just noticed that she emailed me and said, it's time for us to get together. We'll talk for about an hour. When we talk for an hour and we hang up, we are sad because that hour is ended. Not because we screwed it up or something, just because you can't have intimacy all the time. That's a very Jesuit thing. It's not just a Jesuit thing. I think adults need to be willing to become intimate in many places with many people so that you rightly feel sadness that you can't be everywhere that matters to you.
All right, thank you. My next question I feel like you kind of touched on a little bit, but can you tell us about an experience that informed your ideas about social justice?
Pine Ridge, Pine Ridge, Pine Ridge, Pine Ridge. Detroit, 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 Detroit. And it's kind of interesting that I chose those two places because both of them for many years were subject to grotesque stereotypes. In this city, for many years, it was called ruins porn. Pornography that is people who already know the story they want to tell. They fly in town, They take pictures of ruins like the train station or the Packard plant or some battered factory or something. Then they go back and they tell the same story about Detroit, decade after decade. The same precise thing has happened on Pine Ridge for decades and decades. I've heard the same damn stories over and over and over again. Fetal alcohol syndrome, 85% unemployment, blah, 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 blah. And that's infuriating because, yes, those are accurate things, but they're cherry picking to tell a stereotyped story. Back about 20 years ago, NBC News did back in the day when the nightly news for the 3 channels was the dominant communication. And they were going to do 3 nights, about 8 or 9 minutes each night, about Pine Ridge, South Dakota. Well, I was, I think I was here already, so it was after 1980. And I said, well, I'll listen to the first one, and I wanted to puke. It was the same stuff. The pictures were of shacks with trash in the yard, that kind of stuff. And I'd seen it over and over again. I just saw the same damn thing in CNN 3 days ago, saying, it's a dead end around here. Nothing ever works. Nothing ever happens around like that. Well, back at that one, I refused to watch it the second. I'm very angry at that stereotype. I've got sick of it in the 60s. I guess. Well, in the early 90s, that's when NBC did this. The English department in the high school, at the Jesuit high school in Pine Ridge, was very angry about this coverage. And they were talking to their teacher, a Jesuit close friend of mine named Bill McKinney, who himself had been a journalist before he became a Jesuit. And he said, well, why didn't you do something about it? And so they divided themselves into 2 groups. One group wrote individual letters to Tom Brokaw. He was the anchor person. And basically said, I want to introduce you to my mother and dad. Both of them have master's degrees. Both of them do responsible jobs around here. Why didn't they make it into your film portrayal? So 20 some of those kids did that, saying, why didn't you talk about these stories? Why only the wreckage in the rooms, the phenol and all that? The other group made a video. They called it The Other Side of the Story. And they filmed people whose houses aren't looking like trash heaps, whose kids get good education or go to college and all that. So that video we would these days call it went viral. What it meant then is it hit the wire services, and it ended up that ABC picked it up. I think they were licking their chops for this thing. These kids were taking on NBC News, and it was a very strong video, and it was a well-done video, and a competent video. So I know all this story because of Bill McKinney. And he said, so the next day, the woman at NBC News in New York who had produced and directed this called me and said, why are you attacking us? I said, because you've done a bad story. And she said, we filmed what we saw. And he said, no, you didn't. I watched your camera crews. I know what they did. I know what they left out. And don't tell me I don't know this stuff. I was an editor at the Milwaukee Journal before I became a Jesuit. They started hollering at each other, and the woman in New York hung up on him. And he was telling me about this. It screwed it up. Maybe we had a shot at a follow-up to what our kids did. But the next day, the executive secretary of Tom Brokaw, called and said, could you come with a couple of the students to New York? I'd like to show you around our city, and I would like you to be on whichever was the morning show for them. Now that's very cool. But it didn't stop CNN just the other day doing the same thing again. I couldn't believe it. Same stories. It's despair everywhere around here, you know. So why did I pick two places to live, most of my adult life, that have been stereotyped for decades by people that don't want to become intimate with tough places in the world. Now it's changing for Detroit. It's pretty thrilling. The New York Times did a piece in the Sunday Travel 2 Sundays ago, Detroit in 36 hours, and it had maybe 15 little patches of places in Detroit, some of them brand new in the last year, and some of them been around for 50 years, like Buddy's Pizza. All of them positive. Now that's so it's changing. About the narrative about Detroit is changing, and that's thrilling to me. The narrative on Pine Ridge is still pretty beat up.
All right. So my next question.
That's my answer to things that motivate me about social justice. They're not all here. They're not all in Pine Ridge, but those were learning places for me that have been very important to me.
Okay. Well, my next question kind of goes along with that one, but how does the Jesuit charism influence your work?
I've already told you that.
Okay.
The spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, the process of starting by trying to ask, where am I now? And am I called to stay there, or am I called to some other place that is the greater good? I've written about that stuff. If you want, you can read it.
Okay. So then my last question would be, how do you see the Society of Jesus and the Church changing in the future?
Well, I remember when the election of the current Pope was going on, and I tend to be one of the people in the metropolitan Detroit area that news media call when there's questions like that. So I was interviewed a few times before the new Pope was elected, and they said, well, who do you think is going to be elected, And I said, well, predicting what those people do when they go into that lockdown place is like predicting a hog on ice. But one of these elections, I said at that time, I don't know if it's this one, but soon, is going to be from someplace other than Europe. And probably it will either be Africa or Latin America or Asia. That's probably what's going to happen. Well, it happened at was the time. That's when our current Pope was elected. He's an Argentinian. What difference does it make to the Jesuits that we in our training now consider it important for all young Jesuits to spend significant periods of time outside their home culture? Like we've had Jesuits here from the current Jesuit is getting a PhD in civil engineering here, Fasu Oban Roch. He's from Cameroon in Africa. He has close friends that are also working in the sciences, the STEM disciplines. There are 7 of them from various parts of Central Africa. All of them are getting PhDs in the United States in the STEM disciplines. That's wonderful. And it's beginning to be the infrastructure for higher education in places like Africa are growing for the Jesuits. There are more people fluent about that. We Jesuits tend to think much less about just Europe and us, and much more about Africa, Latin America, Asia. Our last 3 superiors general, 4. One spent most of his Jesuit life in Japan. One spent most of his Jesuit life in Lebanon. And the next one was Latin America. So we didn't, mostly that used to be Europeans or Americans. So there is a seismic change going on in the Catholic Church about where you pay attention in the world. I think that's very good stuff. So many young Jesuits have met many young Jesuits from parts of the world that are not their part of the world. Most young Jesuits think, in this country, work very hard at becoming fluent in Spanish because it's a no-brainer that there are millions and millions of Spanish-speaking people that live in this country, and despite Donald Trump, there's going to be a lot more of them. So that culture is, when I was at that age, we were studying in a university in the summer. I remember spending an entire summer studying German, worthwhile. But the world is bigger for Jesuits. And the world is, even though we have a fair number of church leaders in this country who tend to be sort of provincial in their worldviews, increasingly Catholic leadership is thinking about a larger world. And that's pretty important. I think one of these decades or centuries, they're going to figure out that you need to not have priesthood that is just for male celibates. That you need to say, Catholics depend on having regular access to the sacraments and to the Mass. And that's not happening anymore. We are much more like Protestants who only have occasional celebrations of that Eucharist. And the reason is the Catholic Church refuses to say that there are lots of people who could be priests. They just don't happen to be males and they don't happen to be celibate. That's not the law of God. That was celibacy came in the year about 1100. And it had to do with the fact that the church owned most of the land in Europe because there was a very disorganized society and the church was about the only organized entity. And so you'd had the problem that you'd have a person who's a priest and that person was beginning to divvy out the parish lands to his kids. And the Pope said, the priest must be married to the church. And he wasn't talking about sex, he was talking about money. Well, here we are 1,000 years later, and for an awful lot of people, they say, you cannot be sexually intimate and be a priest. That's silly. But when is that going to change? I'm not going to put my money on it. There are a lot of people for whom that is a stubborn sticking point. But the church does increasingly know that it's in a lot bigger world in Europe and the U.S. So I'd say that's probably the main single most important change.
All right, well, that was my last question. Thank you so much for doing this with us.
Okay.